Hi, Val. So
Hi.
thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. Could you go ahead and just give us an introduction of
Yeah,
yourself?
thank you for having me, Sarah. So I'm Val Moyer. I am a recent PhD in women's gender and sexuality studies from Stony Brook University. And I'm now currently a researcher with Athlete Ally, which is an organization dedicated to LGBTQ plus inclusion in sports. Great.
Thank you. So you recently co-authored a Hastings Center report called "Examining the Ethics and Impacts of Laws Restricting Transgender Youth Athlete Participation." So congratulations. I read it. I thought it was amazing. I'm going to link to the report in the show notes, but I'd love to talk to you more about your experience of researching and writing this report. So could you just tell us a little bit more about like yourself, your scholarship, and how you came to author this piece?
Yeah. Well, I think first I should shout out Amanda Zink and Brendan Parent, who are my co-authors, who are also, super important in getting this piece organized and together and out there, which is fantastic. So I do want to kind of be clear about my own positionality. So I'm a white, cisgender, able-bodied scholar who's working on gender and sports policy from kind of a feminist lens. And so I come to this topic in part because I competed in track and field and cross country in college in my undergrad, um, while also taking great gender and sexuality studies classes. This was at University of Vermont. Um, and so I was seeing that like the school itself was really ahead of kind of the mainstream on gender inclusivity, on queer and trans topics. Um, but that was not necessarily translating to the world of athletics that I was in. And so I kept kind of getting stuck on those conundrums of how to be more inclusive in a sports space, which is, fully binary men's and women's sports. Even though I was doing track where we all competed, we went to the same meets and it was the same team. Um, so that kind of brought me into my PhD work, where I gained, a better intersectional analysis, I think, and a broader and deeper historical view of the policing of women's bodies in particular in sports. Um, and so I, came out of that work and was talking to Brendan Parent, who I know personally. And he is always asking how we can move away from gender as a model of sports in general. And he's really interested in that philosophical question and ethical question. But I was sort of like, hang on, we need to address what's going on now. I was starting to get interested in this topic in 2010 through 2014 in my undergrad, and we are at a very different political moment around trans athletes in sports now than we were then. And so we wanted to take the opportunity to, critically reflect and analyze what's happening right now, particularly in youth sports. So we've seen this rise, this wave of state level laws that are attempting to exclude trans kids. Mostly they're directed at transgender girls, but they sometimes include trans boys. So trying to exclude those kids from school sports in particular and from youth sports. And so this is happening across the country. It's being kind of battled in court right now, but we're seeing the effects happen from a lot of angles where, elite sports are trying to figure this out. There was a huge shift back at the NCAA level very recently. So there's a lot going on in this space, and we wanted to just get in there and think about it a little more.
So you have written, multiple pieces on this issue of transgender inclusion in sports. And in one of your pieces, you bring up an issue that I think is really interesting and important to highlight, which is that these aggressive legislative initiatives to ban trans athletes, specifically youth athletes, from playing sports on teams in a manner consistent with their gender identity really seems to be contrary or just without any like overwhelming public support for the legislation, or even really any empirical evidence that there's a need to address this issue legislatively. So, I'm very interested in your thoughts on a couple
Mm-hmm.
things as somebody who's really immersed yourself in these issues. So the first is what is behind this push from conservative lawmakers to make this such a hot political issue?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, because I've heard that it's sort of like a solution without a problem, is how a lot of people are talking about this. So sometimes lawmakers in kind of the public forums of these bills can't point to an example of even a trans girl that they know competing in their state at all, let alone, dominating girls' sports, which is the verbiage that's often used.
Or destroying
Yes, yes. There's a lot of really inflammatory language, and that's on purpose, right? To really scare people. And so I think what's happening, we saw this there was a precursor to this, I think, and a lot of political scientists talk about this with the bathroom bill in North Carolina that attempted to ban trans people from using the bathrooms in alignment with their gender identity. And once again, used the figure of like the little girl who was often imagined as a white cisgender girl in the bathroom as the victim in this scenario that they kind of painted over and over again. And so that didn't work. That got pretty shut down. There was a lot of backlash towards the bathroom bills. But really starting in 2020, it seems like conservative think tanks and advocacy groups realized that there was kind of some passion and fervor that could be created around sports and around trans girls in sports. And I think that's, a lot of it's, our culture is very, we love sports, things like that. And so they kind of perpetuated the narrative that trans girls were taking over sports. They used the very few and far between examples of trans girls who were competing well, who were winning at times, again, without very little, no context really, that we can't, the examples of trans girls that are competing well in high school are not necessarily dominating at all. And they're only really covered and talked about in the media when they're winning. And so Andrea Yearwood and Terry Miller, who are two girls in Connecticut, are often cited in either legislation itself or debates around legislation. They happened to go 1 and 2 in one event at a state meet one time, and were subsequently beaten in future state meets, but that's not really talked about. So it's a lot of taking very, very few and far between instances and really blowing them up. But that has really worked to kind of stoke this fear that this might be happening more, or that without this legislation, there could be this so-called takeover. And it has worked, I think, in part to kind of mobilize a conservative base, but also to act as a wedge issue. So some, moderate voters look at this and think well, I should probably support whoever's introducing this bill, because it's posed as just a necessary thing that has to happen. And so this was also, these bills were being passed during COVID, and they've sort of escalated from there. So that's what's going on. The other thing is, since sort of the beginning of this wave, we've also seen women who are formerly high-profile athletes kind of forming coalitions with more conservative entities. So the Women's Sports Policy Working Group, which includes Martina Navratilova and Nancy Hogstad-Makar, formed and posed, like framed themselves as the middle ground and trying to be, scientific, but have since aligned more and more with conservative groups or with um, women's organizations that are explicitly trans exclusive. And so we've seen these kind of odd lobbying bedfellows forming in the past few years as well. Yeah.
So you touched on this a little bit. I'd like to focus on this a little more. As someone who did compete scholastically, why do you think this question of who can play on what teams, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even at the youth level, why do you think it's so polarizing? What is going on with our sports culture that you mentioned, specifically youth sports, that raises the temperature and inspires so much investment on this issue?
Yeah, I think there are quite a few factors going on. One is definitely the idea that sports are somehow like an exception to other areas of society. So I've heard people say, I'm fine with trans people in any other form of society, like I want to validate their gender when using the bathroom, in day-to-day life with their pronouns, but sports, people just can't quite get their head around it. And because it's seen as something that's so physical and so in the realm of biology, and there are the ideals of fairness or creating a level playing field that allow people, I think, to see sports as not connected to society in this way. Of course, if you're going to school and competing in sports at that school and you identify as a certain gender throughout the day and then go compete on a team that doesn't align with that gender, that's a huge deal for a kid in school. That is potentially a safety issue, besides just being a problem. But also that, and we'll get to this later, I think, but that there are other factors, other societal factors that of course shape sports already. So it's not separate from society, even though we tend to think it is. So that's definitely happening. The other kind of factors are, I think, there's been such a slow but important progress in girls' sports and in girls having access to sports in schools with Title IX and, the work that was done in and around that. And, we are still not equal in terms of sports opportunities for girls by any means, let alone equitable, and so I think people are kind of defensive and holding tightly to what they see as having been hard won. And so in that way, trans girls are kind of used as the scapegoat of that being trans inclusive will somehow mark the end of girls' sports. And of course, we know that's not true, in part because there have been trans inclusive policies at the NCAA level for over 10 years and even longer at the Olympic and elite levels. So this sort of impending takeover or end to girls' sports is misplaced. It's not happening. And inequity is coming from many other sources, from funding, from coaching abuse, things like that. But that's not what we're kind of focusing on in this debate. And then the last factor, which I think is really important, is particularly high school sports, but I'm sure that it starts earlier, have become this really heightened competitive thing in the US as a potential way to get college scholarship, right? And I personally don't think that high school sports should function like that. I think they need to continue to be a really open space where kids can afford to do sports, where they have access to try new things, where, team and the experience is like the main focus rather than trying to compete at a high level to potentially get scholarships. And the other thing is that, again, focusing on the idea that trans girls are quote unquote taking scholarships or taking spots away from cisgender girls kind of misunderstands how college recruiting works in general. It's sort of like if you're at this really high level of sports, which is, the top, I think 5 to 10% of high school athletes go on to compete in college. So it's sort of like if you're there and you're reaching out to coaches at the schools you want to go to, which should be a conversation not just about sports, right? But do you want to go to that school at all? And so it's a two-way thing where high school athletes are talking to coaches. They're looking at other financial things like outside of just sport performance. Coaches will look at your FAFSA and things like that. So for example, Leah Thomas is a swimmer at Penn State. And so she attends, that's an Ivy League school where they don't give out sports scholarships. So whether she's on an academic scholarship that's, really more of a sports scholarship, we don't know, but that's been misrepresented in news outlets as her taking college scholarships. So a lot of kind of misinformation swirling around the high school to college athletics move, but also just the idea that youth sports and high school sports in particular are this, big funnel and way to get a scholarship and access to college, which I don't think should be the case. And college should be affordable, regardless of whether you have an athletic scholarship, but that's a different issue altogether.
Absolutely. Well, and also even participation in college athletics doesn't necessarily have, professional or financial consequences, benefits for people down the road. Leah's college swimming career was, notable, but Leah's in law school now,
right?
And probably is not going to swim competitively at any point in the near future. So it's, I don't know, ultimately seems somewhat inconsequential, right?
Yes.
Whether Leah won or lost ultimately.
Yeah.
I don't think it had any impact on what Leah is choosing to do today.
Yes. So. And there's such a small percentage, high school to college is such a small percentage of athletes. And then the percentage of those college athletes who go on to professional competitive careers is even smaller. So yeah, we're really focused on this kind of tiny percentage while trying to regulate the rest of us, Yeah.
Right. Entire communities for the benefit of like a very small percentage of the population. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I think wasn't, the same argument was made about, girls, female athletes taking, funds and opportunities away from male athletes when Title I was enacted. And all of a sudden schools needed to redirect resources away from boys sports to girls sports, right? That there was a outcry.
And that's also like part of why we don't have co-ed sports is what you were just talking about, of not wanting to direct any of the, like high grossing sports, football, basketball, etc. And so creating separate teams allowed them to kind of keep separate funding streams. Definitely. That's all part of it.
So I do want to come back to talk more about, I want to talk more about like fairness in competition, but I want to get there a different way.
Yeah.
So I want to talk first about and more specifically about the Department of Education's proposed amendments to the Title IX regulations on sex-based eligibility criteria for inclusion or exclusion from single gender athletic teams. I think that you and I probably agree that these changes are laudable in that they, are motivated by a recognition of the need to provide greater protection and opportunity for trans athletes in response to a lot of the state legislation that you're talking about. But there are a couple things that, I have found interesting. And I'd like to get your thoughts. So, in reading through the agency documents or the DOE, explanation of the proposed rule, it really seems to implicitly at the very least, and maybe even explicitly, perpetuate the myth that cisgender girls will always be outperformed by trans girls. And, that's rooted in this sort of popularly accepted but factually unsupported notion of biological advantage. And, the place where I feel like this is most visible in the document is the discussion of the need for different sex-related criteria at higher levels of competition where more is at stake, right? So where fairness demands it. And, the DOE does say this criteria must be fact-based, not just based on assumption. It does suggest to me that, like, in reviewing individual school or district policies, there may be a willingness on the part of the DOE to accept sort of exclusionary criteria more easily in these instances, which it specifically says can include high school teams. So, what's your take on that? And, what are the problems? And I know you've written about this, like, what are the problems involved with equating biological factors like hormone levels, lean body mass, height, etc., with the potential for athletic performance? Do you really think, do you think science unambiguously supports this, biological advantage framework?
No, and I like your term unambiguously, because that's sort of the sticking point here, is that it's very ambiguous. There's a lot of complexity and research that is going into this question, but it's very unclear right now, and there is not a clear consensus that trans women, and again, all these studies have been done with adults, have or retain an athletic advantage. So science does not unambiguously support this sex-based criteria. Even when we talk about hormone levels, which particularly are often used as a metric at the elite level, even that is not well grounded in science. And so I think one of the big things to remember is just that there's a huge assumption that someone who is assigned male at birth will always outcompete someone who's assigned female at birth. And we tend to think of athletic capacity as this like polar opposites between male and female assigned bodies. But that's not the case. So even when we look at that elite level, the performance gap between male and female athletes is something like 10 to 12%. So yeah, that's a significant gap when you're looking at exact times at the Olympics or whatever. But that also tells us that there is a huge overlap in athletic performances among just differently sexed bodies, right? And so I think it's also important just to note that sex itself is a spectrum. So people have intersex traits that don't neatly fit into the male and female categories. But even beyond those kind of what we think of as sex characteristics, height, body type, all of those things are really variable. And they don't always compute with athletic performance, right? So there's sort of like these body composition things about hormones and height and, oxygen capacity. But that doesn't always translate exactly to athletic advantage in any given sport, especially when we're talking about youth where they might be trying out sports for the first time. There's room for like a ton of improvement, or they might have a huge growth spurt in 1 year. So really, when we try to like entrench these sex differences, I think it especially falls apart in youth sports where there's just a huge range of bodies to begin with and athletic ability on top of that. So I think we need to really think carefully about what that means and what sex eligibility does in these spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, and you brought up the two Connecticut track and field athletes who you know, are often cited as an
Hmm.
example of the trans girl advantage. But, you know, interestingly, you never see discussions of instances where trans boys um, outperform
Yes,
cisgender boys
right.
in sport
Hmm.
either. um, so I do want to come back to this discussion of
Yeah.
fairness. So, you know, the fairness is discussed throughout the, you know, notice of proposed rulemaking as an educational objective, a legitimate educational objective that could merit some exclusion of trans
Hmm.
athletes. And in the Hastings Center report, you point out you make a really excellent point about the myth of sports as a meritocracy, just more broadly, that I never really see discussed in this debate, and I'd like to really elevate, you know, that discussion. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I think there's been a lot of great critiques of fairness from critical sports studies scholars. So seeing fairness not as a given, but as like this elusive ideal that may never really be able to be achieved, even in sports. I think that's because there are certain types of advantage that we don't focus on, that we think, or that is not part of the discussion. And so that comes from things like having access to, you know, top-notch facilities in which to train. You know, does your school have a weight room for your sports? Things like that. Does your school have a swimming pool that you can access? But even beyond that, things like nutrition, like, you know, I go to like air quality. Can you safely move outside of your home? And so that's where we start to see class and race and geographic location come into this debate, in addition to things like gender and sexuality, where like if your local sports team, even at the youth level, is like super homophobic, that's an access issue, right? That's an issue where you might not feel comfortable in that space. If the sport is super white, that might change who participates in it and feels comfortable participating in it. So those small like atmosphere, sports culture things, to like the big, like, do you have the structures that you need to participate in sports and keep getting better? And so I didn't talk about this in the report, but I often think of myself as an example. So I grew up in a suburb that was really outside of Washington, D.C. and Virginia, that was really designed around being able to walk and have access to pools and things like that for its residents. And you know, it was pretty diverse, but at the same time, I did swim team every single summer, and my parents had the time to, you know, drive me to swim practice and go to all the meets. Um, I played soccer, you know, classic suburban soccer leagues in the fall and the spring. And so, what that means, or what that translates to, is by the time I get to high school, I have an endurance capacity, right? And so, we start to see how those kind of structures that we think of as outward um, actually change your physical capacities as well and your athletic capacities. So I think those are the kinds of, when we talk about privilege and inequity and sports, that those kinds of advantages are not regulated. You know, you can have a personal trainer to help you get really good at your sport, and that might help you get to college, right? And so when we're kind of focusing once again on gender and sex as this place where unfair advantage happens, and kind of exclusively looking at trans girls as holding unfair advantage, but we're not talking about all of these other forms of unfair advantage that are more like baked into our society as a whole, and that might really drastically, you know, the percentages of advantage might drastically differ from someone who has access to sports from a young age versus someone who doesn't. Um, and then I think it's important to keep, once we go to this like broad societal view, to also look at the very real day-to-day marginalization of trans kids who are trying to, navigate school systems where they may or may not be accepted, feel comfortable in their bodies, and everyone's gender journey and trans experience is different, but so it's not all that it's bad, right? But even in inclusive spaces, I think it's important to keep those kind of broader systems of power in mind when we're talking about
Right.
athletic advantage. Yeah.
Right. Because even in a, progressive and, forward thinking environment, it is still not standard for a high schooler to identify
Right.
as trans. That's just not the majority of high school students. And so, the experience of any, non-dominant group is going to be different than that of the dominant group. So that's like a really important point. So, you have a deep knowledge and understanding of this issue and have been writing in this space for a long time. So, what are your thoughts on where we're headed with this proposed rule? The proposed rule exists in a broader environment that is pushing in the opposite direction. So, if the proposed rule ultimately becomes the final rule in a relatively similar way, is this heading us in the right direction and just falling short of the target, or is it just really not accomplishing much at all? You have offered up some other approaches to improving inclusivity for trans athletes. So, maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm a little worried that it's not doing much at all, but that's my cynical side talking. I am glad about having any kind of, large, powerful pushback on blanket bans on trans athletes. I think that's a really important stance to take. And to kind of get this topic out of state legislatures. Like, I really do feel like this needs to be, and I might backtrack on saying this, in future years, but like it's a community and school topic, I think, that should not be used for political gain, really. And that the kind of rhetoric that we're hearing around it has done such harm really broadly. So I'm glad to see that stance taken. At the same time, what we've seen, it reminds me a little bit of what the International Olympic Committee did, where they said, we are not making the policy. It needs to go on a sport by sport basis. So since then, we've seen each sport governing body trying to make their own rules. And what we've seen is that happens really fast often and feels reactive and is done with a not very much transparency at all about who's in the room making those policy decisions. And so I do worry that this is kind of laying the groundwork for those kinds of really non-transparent, non-democratic policy decisions being made instead of actually consulting with trans athletes and parents of trans kids and, the people that are going to be impacted by these kinds of policies. So I do worry about that. And I also think that the more cloudiness that's allowed in this space leaves trans athletes kind of in like a bureaucratic limbo of like, okay, well, what do I do? How do I navigate this space? Because the answers are not clear and they're kind of bouncing back and forth between the state or this, interscholastic governing body. There's a lot of policy decision makers at play here, and it can, I think, really leave trans kids out of sports, like in the meantime, while they're waiting for answers on how to do it according to the rules. Right. Yeah. So it feels exhausting a little bit. But I I also think just in general, there's sort of a missed opportunity to think critically about when and where we need gendered categories in sports, especially youth sports, I think. Um, and that could be a great question, like more of an open-ended question about, do we need, what about co-ed youth sports? What about different models of play and competition that encourage the kinds of things we want to encourage, like teamwork, communication, confidence, mental health, all of those great things, and downplay the scores and the star player and things like that. And so it's tricky also because I do think non-co-ed girls sports at times is built to combat like the sexism of coaches who might play young boys. Young boys might get more playing time on co-ed teams because of that ingrained sexism. And so, but I think that's then its own little problem rather than making a whole model to try to combat that. So I do think we need to really think about what is the purpose of gender categories, when, where, and when can we push against them and kind of play with them, especially for non-binary kids, of which there's like a growing population of youth who identify as non-binary, and right. Just the structure of sports itself as in binary gender categories can feel exclusive to them. So yeah, I'm up for much more. Co-ed is not always the right term, but much more play with gender and sports categories, particularly at the youth level. I think there needs to be room for that.
Yeah, we haven't talked about this before, but I'm curious. I can think of, like, for me, I can think of just an example comes to mind of, a sport. It's a non-traditional sport where sort of mixed gender team competition is normalized, and that's CrossFit, right? So CrossFit team competition involves teams comprised of men and women. It's a requirement. CrossFit also just for the last few years does allow athletes to participate according to their gender identity. So a team could be made of, two cis males, a trans woman, and a cis woman, for example. Not that I can think of any examples of those off the top of my head, but that is a really successful and exciting model of team competition. It's fantastic to watch. I think people really enjoy it. Can you think of any other examples?
Yeah, I like that example a lot. I really think ultimate frisbee has figured something out that a lot of other sports have not, and I think it kind of comes from its like casual alternative culture. I can't remember exactly the team structures, but they have like a mixed team and then a men's team, and then I think also, from my understanding and talking to collegiate UFrizz athletes, is like even the women's team is like super open-ended to like non-binary folks and trans men and whoever else like feels comfortable in that space. So I think just a little less regulation is good, but and I like the CrossFit example because at times there can be co-ed requirements or mixed gender requirements that still really re-entrench that trans people are not allowed still, right? It's like, it's mixed gender, but just cis women and just cis men. So I think we have to be kind of like careful and cognizant of that as well. But yeah, Frisbee's my example for now. But the other thing I think is like, especially in like less competitive, less institutionalized sporting spaces, there's a lot of room to kind of push against gender expectations, even like, even just like workout classes where men feel like they're supposed to outperform all the women in the classes. Like that needs to be taken apart as well. yeah, so that's the only example I have off the top of my head. But the people go to like weight classes are an interesting thing. Like, what if there were weight classes in particular sports regardless of gender? Um, or I guess on the kind of metric performance side, there's a great equation, I think it is, that looks at strength per pound of mass rather than overall strength. And I think that according to that, a woman has the bench press, like pound for pound strength in bench press. That record is held by a woman. So I think there are some interesting ways to rethink sport performance, even. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're talking about the formula that's used in competitive
Yes,
weightlifting, like Olympic
yeah.
weightlifting. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, you're 100% correct. And that is a completely gender neutral, calculation that could be used in competition, and that's a great
Yeah.
example. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. Again, congratulations on the piece to you and your co-authors. I've really appreciated your perspective. It's incredibly interesting. Just your area of scholarship in general is really interesting to me. And, I really look forward to seeing what you produce in the future.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me, Sarah.